Imagine a man who would change the course of European history, Benito Mussolini, born on July 29, 1883, in the small Italian town of Predoppio. This name would soon echo across the world as the founder of fascism and the first of 20th century Europe's infamous dictators. Rising to power during a time of political chaos, Mussolini became Italy's prime minister in 1922 and held a firm grip on the country until 1943. As the architect of a totalitarian regime, he blended nationalism, militarism, and propaganda to mold Italy into a fascist state. His bold promises and iron-fisted rule inspired movements far beyond his borders, even as they brought destruction at home. Mussolini's dramatic fall came near the end of World War II, when he was captured and executed near the village of Dongo on April 28, 1945. His life and legacy remain one of the most controversial and studied in modern European history. Benito Mussolini's story begins in the modest setting of a small Italian village, where he was born the first child of the local blacksmith. He would later wear his humble beginnings like a badge of honor, proudly calling himself a man of the people. But the truth, the Mussolini family wasn't quite as humble as Benito liked to claim. His father wasn't just a blacksmith, he was also a part-time socialist journalist and the son of a National Guard lieutenant. Mussolini's mother, a schoolteacher, added a touch of respectability to the family name. Still, they lived in poverty, crammed into two small, run-down rooms in a decaying palazzo. Much of the family's hardship stemmed from Mussolini's father, who spent more time in taverns debating politics and more money on his mistress than providing for his wife and 3 children, who often had to make do with meager meals. From an early age, Benito was a storm in the making, restless, defiant, aggressive. At school, he bullied classmates and challenged authority. His behavior quickly overwhelmed the teachers at his village school, so he was sent off to a boarding school run by the strict Salesian order in Faenza. But the plan backfired spectacularly. There, young Mussolini became even more violent, stabbing one student with a penknife and lashing out at a priest who tried to discipline him. He was expelled. Another school, another expulsion, this time from the Giosuè Carducci school in Forlimpopoli, after yet another penknife assault. Yet behind all this turbulence, Mussolini was no fool. He had a sharp mind, passed his final exams with ease, and even earned a teaching diploma. He briefly worked as a schoolmaster, but quickly found himself unsuited to the profession. At just 19 years old, pale, short, but with a powerful jaw and those unforgettable dark, intense eyes, Mussolini left Italy for Switzerland. He had almost nothing except a nickel medallion of Karl Marx in his pocket. Over the next few months, he wandered from job to job, living hand to mouth. But even then, people noticed him. There was something about Mussolini, a strange charisma, a magnetic presence, and a voice that could stir a crowd. He devoured the works of philosophers like Kant, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Hegel, and Marx, cherry-picking ideas to fit his growing hunger for influence and power. Though he lacked a consistent ideology, his force of personality made up for it. He started to make waves as a political journalist and orator, producing propaganda for a trade union, pushing for strikes, and calling for violence to achieve political goals. Repeated arrests didn't stop him. In fact, they only added to his growing legend. By the time he returned to Italy in 1904, even the Roman newspapers were starting to take notice of the name Benito Mussolini. For a while after returning to Italy, Mussolini seemed to fade into the background. Little was heard of him. He went back to teaching, this time in the remote and quiet setting of the Venetian Alps, north of Udine. But this wasn't a period of personal growth, in fact. Mussolini would later describe this chapter of his life as one of moral deterioration. Disillusioned with the aimlessness of it all, He quickly abandoned the life of a schoolmaster and returned to what truly stirred his spirit: trade union activism, radical journalism, and the charged world of extreme politics. Unsurprisingly, this path landed him behind bars yet again. But in 1909, during a rare stretch of freedom, his life took another dramatic turn. Mussolini fell in love with 16-year-old Rachel Guidi, the younger daughter of his father's widowed mistress. Rachel soon moved in with him, sharing a damp and cramped apartment in Forlì. Their bond grew stronger, and they eventually married, but even that didn't slow Mussolini down. Not long after the wedding, he found himself imprisoned for the 5th time. By now, however, Comrade Mussolini was no longer just a fringe agitator. He had become widely recognized as one of the most gifted and dangerous young voices in Italy's socialist movement. He wrote prolifically, contributing to a wide range of socialist newspapers. But that wasn't enough. Mussolini launched his own publication, La Lotta di Class. The Class Struggle, a bold and provocative paper that gained significant traction. His meteoric rise continued, and in 1912, he reached a major milestone. He was appointed editor of Avanti, Forward, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party. Under his fiery leadership, the paper's circulation doubled. As editor, Mussolini used the platform to rail against war, nationalism, and imperialism. He stood firmly against Italy's potential intervention in World War I, delivering his views in thunderous editorials that shook the establishment and electrified the far left. In just a few years, Mussolini had transformed from a restless rebel into a political force to be reckoned with. But soon, Benito Mussolini would make a dramatic and controversial pivot, one that would forever change his life and the political future of Italy. Despite his earlier thunderous opposition to war, he changed his mind about intervention in World War I, influenced by Karl Marx's idea that social revolution often follows war, and convinced that the defeat of France would be a death blow to liberty in Europe. Mussolini flipped his stance completely. Suddenly, the same man who had passionately condemned the war was now writing articles and delivering speeches with equal, if not greater, intensity, this time in favor of Italy entering the conflict. This shift shocked his comrades. He resigned from Avanti, and, as a result of his new pro-war position, was officially expelled from the Socialist Party. But Mussolini was not about to disappear. Backed financially by the French government and powerful Italian industrialists, both eager to see Italy wage war against Austria, Mussolini took the helm of a new newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, or the People of Italy. It became the mouthpiece of his new ideology, where he boldly declared a break from his past with a fiery proclamation: "From today onward we are all Italians and nothing but Italians. Now that steel has met steel, one single cry comes from our hearts: Viva l'Italia! Long live Italy!" This was more than a call to arms. It was the birth cry of fascism. Mussolini had rebranded himself not just as a nationalist, but as the face of a new political force. And to prove his commitment, he didn't just talk about war, he went to fight in it. Mussolini, once the radical socialist rebel, had now become a soldier of the Italian state, marching straight into the crucible of World War I, forging the identity that would soon make him a dictator. Wounded in action, while serving with the elite Bersaglieri, Italy's corps of sharpshooters, Benito Mussolini returned home not just with scars, but with a hardened worldview. He was now a convinced anti-socialist, a man consumed by a sense of destiny. As early as February 1918, he began calling for the rise of a dictator, a man who is ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep, someone who could rescue Italy from the deepening economic and political chaos. Just 3 months later, in a fiery and widely reported speech in Bologna, Mussolini hinted that he might be that man. By 1919, The foundations of his new vision were already forming in Milan. Inside a modest office on Piazza San Sepolcro, about 200 people gathered: Republicans, anarchists, syndicalists, discontented socialists, restless revolutionaries, and disillusioned soldiers. They weren't united by a single ideology, but by frustration, anger, and ambition. From this unlikely mix, Mussolini launched what he called the Fasci di Combattimento, fighting bands, a new political force. These Fasci were named after the ancient Roman symbol of unity and authority. The fasces, a bundle of rods bound tightly together, representing strength through unity. And with that, fascism was born and its enduring symbol created. At rallies, Mussolini captivated crowds with his raw energy, dressed in black and surrounded by his supporters in matching black shirts. He cut an imposing figure. His speaking style, sharp, repetitive, commanding, was electrifying. He was theatrical and unpredictable. His facts were often wrong, his views contradictory, and his targets unfair. Yet his words dripped with drama, his metaphors hit hard, and his relentless, animated gestures gripped audiences. Logic didn't matter, emotion did, and in that Mussolini excelled. Soon, his influence spilled from speeches to action. Fascist squads, some directed by Mussolini, others formed by local leaders, infiltrated the Italian countryside. In the Po Valley and across the Puglian Plains, they hunted down socialists, torched union and party offices, and terrorized entire towns. Hundreds of radicals were publicly humiliated, beaten, or killed. By late 1920, these black shirt squads, often backed by wealthy landowners, began targeting local governments, halting the rise of left-wing administrations. Mussolini encouraged their violence, even as he tried to rein it in. He personally led similar raids around Milan. By the end of 1921, much of Italy had fallen under fascist control, while the political left, demoralized and disorganized, had all but disintegrated. The ruling government, led by middle-class liberals, turned a blind eye, partly due to weak leadership, and partly because they wanted the left destroyed. Fascism was rising fast, fed by nationalism and anti-Bolshevik fears, and Mussolini was preparing for his ultimate move, a national power grab. That moment came in the summer of 1922. The fractured trade union movement attempted one last show of force, a general strike. But Mussolini pounced. He warned the government, "Stop the strike, or the fascists will." True to their word, fascist volunteers helped crush the strike, reinforcing their claim as Italy's new guardians of order. Just months later, on October 24th, Mussolini stood before 40,000 fervent supporters in Naples. With bold confidence, he declared, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome." The crowd roared in response. Voices unified in thunderous rhythm: "Roma! Roma! Roma!" The message was clear. The march had begun. Later that very day, as excitement and urgency gripped the fascist ranks, Mussolini and his top lieutenants made a fateful decision. For days from then, the fascist militia would launch a full-scale advance on Rome. The plan was bold. Armed fascists would move in converging columns, each led by one of four senior party members' men who would go down in history as the Quadrimviri. But notably, Mussolini himself was not one of them. Despite being the movement's face and voice, he stayed behind. Why? Because Mussolini was still clinging to the hope of a political solution. He didn't want to take power by brute force, at least not yet. He made it clear he would not act until King Victor Emmanuel III officially summoned him, in writing. While the black shirts mobilized across Italy, preparing weapons, securing roads, and gathering in secret, Mussolini waited. The march on Rome was underway, even if it wasn't quite the disciplined, glorious operation fascist propaganda would later portray. In reality, it was chaotic, improvised, and riddled with logistical issues. But it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be menacing enough to shake the political establishment, and it was. The threat worked. The sitting government collapsed under pressure, and then the moment Mussolini had waited for arrived. The king reluctant to order military resistance, and fearing civil war, chose to accept the fascist alternative. He sent the telegram summoning Mussolini to Rome. With those few written words, Benito Mussolini's rise was sealed not through a violent coup, but through royal invitation. The revolution had succeeded, and the era of fascist rule in Italy had begun. On October 31st, 1922, Benito Mussolini stood tall as the youngest prime minister in Italian history, and he knew the significance of that moment. His pride wasn't misplaced. Yes, his rise had been helped by the chaos of the time's political instability, economic despair, but it wasn't just luck. Mussolini's stunning ascent was fueled by his forceful personality, razor-sharp instincts, bold opportunism, and his unmatched ability to agitate and inspire. Determined to present himself not only as the leader of fascism, but as the unifier of all Italians, Mussolini handed the king a list of ministers. Most weren't even members of his party. This was no accident. It was a calculated move to project inclusivity while masking his true intentions. Behind the scenes, he made one thing crystal clear. He would rule with authority. And rule he did. Mussolini secured full dictatorial powers for 1 year. Within that year, he steamrolled through legislation that rigged the parliamentary system in favor of the fascists. The 1924 elections, tainted by blatant fraud and intimidation, delivered him a parliamentary majority and cemented his grip on power. Many Italians, especially in the weary middle class, embraced him. After years of strikes, protests, and political paralysis, Mussolini's flamboyant style, his promises of national revival, and the pageantry of fascism felt like a breath of fresh air. People were willing to trade freedom for stability. To them, Mussolini looked like the one man who could bring order out of chaos, and in many ways, he delivered, at least on the surface. Order was restored, and the fascists launched bold public works projects across the country. But this newfound order came at a staggering cost. Italy's fragile democracy was quietly dismantled. The nation became a one-party state. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions dissolved. The press muzzled. Free speech crushed under the boot of surveillance, censorship, and terror. A sprawling network of spies and secret police kept the people in check. Even moderate liberals and Catholics weren't safe. No one who dared oppose the regime was spared. Then came a turning point that shook the nation. In 1924, Giacomo Matteotti, a courageous socialist deputy and one of fascism's most vocal critics, was kidnapped and brutally murdered by Mussolini's own henchmen. The Matteotti crisis sent shockwaves through Italy. For a brief moment, it looked like Mussolini's reign might collapse under the weight of public outrage. But the Il Duce was too entrenched, too ruthless, and too politically agile. He weathered the storm and emerged more determined than ever. Mussolini had tasted absolute power, and he wasn't about to let it go. As Mussolini tightened his grip on Italy, a cult of personality emerged around him, engineered by fascist propaganda and embraced by admirers both at home and abroad. He was hailed as a genius, a visionary, even a superman. Public figures worldwide marveled at what they believed to be miraculous achievements. Here was a man, they claimed, who had breathed new life into a divided and demoralized nation. Mussolini had delivered sweeping social reforms, spearheaded vast public works, and, remarkably, done it all without alienating Italy's powerful industrialists and landowners. He had even reached a historic accord with the papacy, healing a rift that had existed since the unification of Italy. On the surface, Mussolini appeared unstoppable, a man of action with the results to prove it. But peel back the glossy layer of fascist propaganda, and the reality was far more troubling. The social divide in Italy remained deep and unresolved. The country's fundamental problems, economic fragility, inefficient governance, and systemic inequality, were barely touched. Behind the myth of the infallible Duce was a leader increasingly driven by arrogance, xenophobia, and an obsession with imperial glory. And it was this toxic ambition that would lead Mussolini down the path to ruin. His eyes soon turned to Ethiopia. After months of aggressive rhetoric, thinly veiled threats, and military preparation, Italy launched a brutal invasion in October 1935. What followed was a vicious colonial war, marked by the indiscriminate use of poison gas against civilians, a war crime that shocked the world. But while Europe expressed horror, it did little more than wag its finger. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but in a telling act of cowardice, excluded crucial exports like oil, anything that might genuinely cripple Mussolini's war machine or risk igniting a broader European conflict. Mussolini himself admitted that had oil sanctions been enforced, he would have been forced to retreat from Ethiopia within a week. But no such sanctions came. So on the night of May 9, 1936, Mussolini stood before a euphoric crowd of 400,000 in Rome's Piazza Venezia and proclaimed a new empire. In the 14th year of the fascist era, a great event has been accomplished. Italy has its empire. This was the high water mark of Mussolini's popularity. The regime basked in nationalistic pride, but it came with a dark cost. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia drew Mussolini closer to another empire builder, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had quietly supported Mussolini's African adventure and, unlike other Western powers, offered no condemnation. Instead, the two dictators found common ground, and their growing friendship would soon be sealed in steel, the Pact of Steel, a formal alliance that bound Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in a partnership of aggression, war, and eventual destruction. By 1938, Mussolini had fully embraced the toxic ideology of his new ally. In a disturbing echo of Nazi policy, his government passed sweeping anti-Semitic laws. Jews were banned from schools, jobs, and public life. The stage was set for even greater horrors. When World War II erupted, around 20% of Italy's Jewish population would be deported to Nazi death camps, many never to return. The Duce, once celebrated as Italy's savior, was now on a path paved with betrayal, brutality, and bloodshed. Though Benito Mussolini understood that peace was crucial for Italy's survival, that a long and grinding war could be a catastrophe, he was caught in a trap of ambition, envy, and fear of being left out of the spoils. While caution warned him not to march blindly with the Germans, his darker instincts whispered that the Nazis might do good business cheaply, and that by staying out of World War II, Italy would forfeit its part of the booty. His foreign secretary and son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano, later wrote of a tense, meandering discussion at the Palazzo Venezia, where Mussolini at first admitted that war was unwise, only to then reverse himself, claiming that Italy's honor now compelled it to stand with Germany. With each fresh German victory, Mussolini's bitterness and anxiety grew. He watched Hitler's meteoric advances with a twisted mix of resentment and desperation. As Nazi tanks rolled through Europe, Mussolini became more bellicose, privately confessing a strange hope that the Germans might stumble just enough to soothe his pride and buy Italy some breathing room. But when the Nazi blitzkrieg surged west and France teetered on the brink of collapse, Mussolini panicked. Time, he believed, was running out. If he didn't act soon, there would be no spoils left to divide. And so on June 10, 1940, Mussolini made his fateful move. Standing before a nation that had not asked for war, he declared it anyway, plunging Italy into a conflict it was utterly unprepared for. From the outset, the war unraveled into a humiliating disaster. France surrendered almost immediately, before Mussolini's forces could even claim a symbolic victory. As Chano put it, Mussolini left for a meeting with Hitler knowing that his opinion had only a consultative value. It was painfully clear Italy wasn't Hitler's equal, it was his pawn. From that moment on, Mussolini had to confront the brutal reality that he was the junior partner in the Axis alliance. Germany no longer saw Italy as a strategic ally, it treated it like dead weight. Hitler and his generals kept Mussolini in the dark, hiding critical military decisions and informing him only after the fact. The Germans seized Romania, launched the invasion of the Soviet Union, and took action after action without consulting their Italian counterpart. Mussolini, once the brash architect of his own destiny, was now little more than a bystander in Hitler's war, a dictator clinging to illusions of power as his nation was dragged deeper into chaos. After his downfall, Benito Mussolini was first imprisoned on the island of Ponza, then exiled even farther to a remote hotel fortress high atop the Gran Sasso d'Italia in the rugged Abruzzi Mountains. Believing the location impenetrable, the Allies and the new Italian government assumed he was untouchable. But on September 12, 1943, the impossible happened. In a daring, almost mythic rescue operation, German commandos, led by Waffen-SS officer Otto Skorzeny, crash-landed gliders on the slopes behind the hotel and snatched Mussolini away, spiriting him off to Munich by air. The dictator was back, but not in control. Hitler, eager to retain influence over northern Italy, urged Mussolini to form a new fascist government. Eager not to see Italy ruled outright by the Germans, Mussolini agreed, and so the tragic puppet state of the Repubblica Sociale Italiana was born in the town of Salo. But Mussolini, a hollowed-out shell of the leader he once was, admitted grimly that this so-called republic was nothing more than a sham, a regime held hostage by German power. Still, he carried out Hitler's bidding, even overseeing the execution of his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, along with others who had voted against him. While the Allies marched north and the German hold on Italy crumbled, Mussolini wandered in delusion, thinking only of history and how he would appear in it, as one of his ministers observed. His fascist loyalists, meanwhile, stayed the course, rounding up Jews for deportation, torturing suspected partisans, and fighting alongside the Nazis. But the noose tightened. As resistance forces gained ground, the Italian communists decided Mussolini had to die, refusing to flee despite advice from close allies, and even his surviving son Mussolini aimed to make a final stand in the Valtellina Mountains. But there were no followers left, only silence and shame. Desperate, he disguised himself as a German soldier and joined a retreating convoy headed for Austria. But the mask failed. He was recognized, and on April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini and his mistress, Cloretta Petacci, who had chosen to die by his side, were executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies were strung up, head downward, in Milan's Piazza Loreto, a brutal, symbolic end met with cheers from a people long betrayed. The Italian masses, weary from years of dictatorship and war, greeted the death of Il Duce without regret. Mussolini had clung to a twisted dream and dragged his country into ruin. Democracy returned after 2 dark decades, and the neo-fascist movement that lingered on earned a mere 2% of the vote in the 1948 elections. The chapter had closed. Italy was free,